Welcome back, chess friends. It's game number 25, the last one of this match. The score is 15-5 to Le Bourdonnais. Yeah, we're in it just to see who has the last word here. Just before we start, I want to share with you something I found online. It's a moment of tension. If the bishop moves forward, the queen can capture him. So yeah, it's funny because it's the real queen and it's a real bishop. Maybe this guy's a knight, which would make it even better, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, let's start. Le Bourdonnais has the white pieces. He opens with f4. We have d5 and then d4 from Le Bourdonnais. And Morphy, commentating in 1859, says, "This is not to be commended. In this opening, white ought not to prematurely advance his queen's pawn, as many positions may arise where it will become necessary to place it at d3. So he's worried that this is a hole here. If a piece comes in here, he won't have any pawns to attack it. But okay, Le Bourdonnais did play d4, and McDonnell immediately attempts to gambit a pawn with c5. But Le Bourdonnais ignores him. He goes e3, and then we have e6, so both players only moving their pawns at the moment. And then Le Bourdonnais moves knight to f3. We have knight to c6, c4. C captures d4, e captures d4, and d captures c4. And then developing the bishop, capturing the pawn on c4. McDonnell continues developing with knight to f6. Then we have knight to c3, bishop to e7, clearing a space for castling, but Le Bourdonnais beats him to it, but McDonnell castles anyway. And then Le Bourdonnais puts his king in the corner, king to h1. Maybe he thinks it's safer here. And then we continue with a6, bishop to e3, so both players continuing to develop. And then b5 from McDonnell, chasing away the bishop. So the bishop retreats to d3, bishop to b7, knight to e5, king to h8, so both players in the corner with their kings. Bishop back to c2, knight to b4, which attacks the light square bishop, so it moves out of the way to b3. And McDonnell centralizes the knight, but Le Bourdonnais captures it, and McDonnell captures back. So far in the game, everything's very even. We'll continue and see if anything breaks this deadlock. Le Bourdonnais develops his queen to e2, so he's fully developed. His rooks are connected here. And McDonnell doesn't like the knight being so close to his king side, so he plays f6 to try to chase it away. And it does indeed leave. It goes to f3, and then McDonnell plays queen to e8. Now we have rook on a to e1, bishop to d6 with a double attack on this pawn here, and the knight's also attacking the bishop, and the bishop's kind of locked in by the dark square pawn, so Le Bourdonnais decides to move his bishop back to d2 rather than defending this pawn. And McDonnell goes for the pawn, so he's a pawn up, so good stuff for McDonnell and McDonnell fans. Le Bourdonnais captures the knight and the bishop captures the bishop, but it turns out being a pawn up was only temporary because Le Bourdonnais grabs a pawn back. But this allows McDonnell to develop his queen to h5, and you'll see here it's looking quite intimidating because all the bishops are pointing towards the king side and the queen is over there as well, so we'll see how Le Bourdonnais deals with it. Is he intimidated, or does he think this is fine? He continues by pushing his g-pawn and threatening the queen, so the queen retreats to h6. But you'll see that this pawn move here has weakened the diagonal considerably. The knight is now pinned here and it can't move. Maybe McDonnell will be able to exploit this somehow. And in addition to that, this pawn is now looking quite weak because the bishop and the queen are threatening checkmate here should the queen and the knight happen to somehow move. So maybe McDonnell has some plans brewing here. We'll see what happens. Le Bourdonnais probably realizes about this diagonal, so he puts a pawn in the way by pushing d5. And now McDonnell brings his rook across to e8, threatening this bishop, although Le Bourdonnais might not be too worried about it. He's got a lot of defenders. And indeed, Le Bourdonnais moves his queen over to g2. And you'll notice now that there are three pieces in the way of this diagonal now, but one of them is the queen, so maybe a bit risky. And we now have rook to e7. So perhaps McDonnell's trying to double up along the e-file here. Maybe he'll bring the other rook across. Now here, Le Bourdonnais played knight to d4, which is, of course, a massive blunder. And I'll show you how this works. The rook captures the bishop, the knight captures the rook, and now the bishop captures the pawn. And the queen can't capture the bishop back here while it's under attack, because if it moves, then it hangs checkmate on h2. Let's go back to the blunder, knight to d4. Of course, McDonnell didn't spot any of that, and instead he played g6, which is drawing again. So let's continue. He's missed his chance, but maybe he'll get another one. Knight to c6, threatening the rook, so the rook moves to c7, and now rook to e4, which double attacks this bishop, but McDonnell defends it by pushing his g-pawn. And now knight comes over to d4, it's eyeing up this square so that it can then go on to attack the queen. But before that we have rook to d8, and now there's a double attack on this pawn. But of course, as we said, Bourdonnais ignores it and goes for the queen. And now, of course, the queen moves and it goes back to f8. Rook to d1, adding some backup to this pawn, which is under attack by two pieces. It's got two defenders, so it's okay now. But McDonnell adds another attacker, so Bourdonnais adds another defender. McDonnell brings his bishop back up to e5, which attacks this rook, so the rook moves back to d2. And we have rook to c4, so McDonnell is trying something new now. He's given up attacking this pawn. Maybe he's trying to come over to this square and cause trouble, but Bourdonnais brings his knight down to e3 and attacks the rook, which just goes back to c7. And we have queen to f3, trying to get the queen to a better square, and the bishop comes to f4, which is x-raying this rook through the knight. So the rook advances to d3. We have queen to d6, getting off the back rank. And now Morphy comments. He says, black must have won at least a pawn by rook to e7 and I'm not going to bore you with all of Morphy's lines here, it's quite long, but the idea is to double up the rooks along this file and then bring the queen over to the h file, and so everything including the bishop pair is pointing towards the king and looking very dangerous, and this pressure would be too much for white and he'd start dropping pieces, and of course completely winning for McDonnell. However, as I said, I'm not going to bore you with all of that. I'll just take you through what actually happened, which was queen to d6, which is completely drawing again. So good job, McDonnell. Back to your proper form. We continue with knight to f5, attacking the black queen. And now McDonnell really needs to keep the pieces on the board to keep up the complexity and have some chances of winning. He doesn't want to start exchanging pieces off. So queen to e5 would be good, but he doesn't go for that. He starts capturing. Queen captures the bishop, the pawn captures the queen, the bishop captures the white queen, giving a check, so the king moves, and McDonnell's not done yet. He's going to capture the rook and have a rook exchange. And now the white rook's attacking this bishop, but it's also threatening checkmate here on the back rank because the knight's covering this square and the king's got nowhere to go to. So McDonnell has to defend, rook to c8. And here, Bourdonnais, instead of capturing the bishop straight away, pushes the pawn to e7, looking very dangerous, defended by the knight and one square away from queening. So McDonnell gets behind it. He doesn't want that pawn to become a queen. Rook takes bishop, and now McDonnell wants to get his king out of the corner, so king to g8. But this white rook is very active, and it starts going up after the weak wing pawns. McDonnell continues moving his king to f7. Now it's defending the queening square, which will relieve the rook of this boring duty. The white rook just captures the free pawn, and now rook to c8 and b3 from Bourdonnais. And there's not very much that McDonnell can do from this point. He's going to start repeating moves any minute now. Bishop to e5 and now h3 from Bourdonnais. b4, king to g2, now bishop back to f4. King to f3, bishop back to e5, king to e4, bishop back to f4, and now Bourdonnais plays a7, aligning his rook with the king. And what's McDonnell got? Well, he's got nothing. He just puts his bishop back on e5 again. Here Bourdonnais plays knight to g7, which Morphy says is decisive. Well, why is this? Well, it's undefended, but if you capture it, then queening comes with a revealed check from the rook, so you can't capture the queen and everything is just destroyed. So McDonnell doesn't do that. He decides to hold out a few more moves by playing his rook to e8 and giving it up. So knight captures the rook and the king captures the knight. And we continue now with king to f5, so getting his king closer into the action. King to f7, rook to b7, threatening this pawn, and h6 from McDonnell, who has just got nothing at all. Here, labourdonnais plays a4, and McDonnell resigned the last game in the match. So why did he resign here? Well, if he captures en passant, the rook will be able to come across and easily eat up the pawn, and this other pawn will just go across and queen. If he doesn't eat it up, the a pawn's just getting across anyway, and it's all over. So yeah, he held out a few more moves, but it was all over in the end. So yeah, that was the last game of the match. Labourdonnais wins 16 games to 5. So well done to him. I've got one last thing to do. I found a book called Chess and Chess Players by a gentleman named George Walker from 1850. And I'm just going to read you a little section from that book because it's quite nice. The match was over and our champion fairly beaten. The way in which McDonnell met his defeat was to demand his revenge. And a second match was instantly made to consist of 9 games exclusive of draws. So I'll see you next time.